The letter from Adler Crane described a well-established cattle operation outside Laramie, Wyoming territory. It mentioned a solid house, reliable water from the spring creek, and good standing in the community. It did not mention that the solid house had a roof that leaked in 3 places when it rained, that the spring creek ran dry every August, and that his standing in the community consisted mostly of people knowing to leave Adler Crane alone when he was in a mood, which was often. The letter from Sylvie Morrow described a capable woman of practical inclinations. It mentioned experience managing a household and skill with livestock. It did not mention that Sylvie's experience managing a household was her mother's household, where she had done what she was told, rather than what she decided, and that her skill with livestock extended precisely as far as knowing that chickens ate corn and that cows were large. They were both optimists. They were both wrong. The difference between them and most people is that they were wrong in exactly the right directions. I have been collecting stories like this one for a long time. Stories of people who arrived somewhere expecting one thing and found something else entirely, and what they did with the difference. Most people, when the gap between expectation and reality opens up beneath them, fall into it. Some people build a bridge, Adler Crane and Sylvie Morrow, and I want you to remember both names, because this is a story that belongs to both of them equally. They built something better than a bridge. They built a life. But I am getting ahead of myself. Adler Crane was 41 years old in the spring of 1887, and he had the look of a man who had been working hard since before it was legal for him to do so. Lean in the way that isn't healthy so much as inevitable, weathered at the eyes, deliberate in his movements. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, but is simply what happens when a man has been alone long enough that speaking out loud starts to feel like a waste of breath. He had come to Wyoming 11 years earlier with a younger brother, 2 horses, and enough money to make a serious mistake, which is exactly what they did. The mistake was recoverable. The 11 years that followed the mistake were the recovery. By 1887 he had 220 acres outside Laramie, 40 head of cattle, and a house that was better than a tent if you were being charitable, which most people weren't. He had also, in those 11 years, buried the younger brother, lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a fence wire incident he did not like to discuss, and come to the settled conclusion that loneliness was simply the cost of living in a place worth living in. What changed his mind was a winter. The winter of 1886 to 1887 killed cattle across the whole territory. Not his whole herd. He was smarter and luckier than some, but enough. Enough that by February he was doing the math in his head at night and not liking what it added up to. He needed more hands than he could pay for. He needed someone who could run the house while he was out working from first light to last. He needed, though he would not have said it this way at the time, another person. He wrote to a matrimonial agency in Denver. He wrote the letter the way he wrote everything. Plainly, without embellishment, describing the operation and the situation, and what he was looking for in functional terms. Then he looked at what he had written, and decided it sounded like a classified advertisement for a hired hand, which was not quite the impression he wanted to make. So he added 2 sentences about the landscape and the quality of the light over the Laramie Range in the evening. Those 2 sentences were the most honest thing in the letter. They were also the thing that made Sylvie Morrow write back. Sylvie Morrow was 34, the eldest daughter of a cotton broker in Memphis, Tennessee, and she had spent the better part of a decade being competent in ways that no one particularly valued. She could run a ledger, she could manage a staff of 6, she could negotiate with suppliers and settle disputes between workers and keep her father's accounts in better order than he kept them himself. None of this had ever resulted in anyone asking her opinion on anything that mattered. What she wanted, if anyone had thought to ask, was to be somewhere that needed what she actually had. Not her face. Not her family name. Not her ability to pour tea and make pleasant conversation and pretend she found the whole enterprise satisfying. What she had was a brain and a spine and an appetite for problems that required both, and Memphis in 1887 had no particular use for any of it in a woman her age. She had watched her 2 younger sisters marry men who needed managing and settle into lives of organized dissatisfaction. She had decided around her 33rd birthday that she would rather take a risk than take the same road. The matrimonial agency seemed like a risk. Wyoming seemed like an enormous one. She read Adler's letter 3 times. The first time for facts, the second time for what was between the facts. The third time she read only those 2 sentences about the evening light over the mountains, and she thought, this is a man who notices things and doesn't know how to say so. That was interesting to her in a way she could not have explained. She wrote back. She described herself accurately in every way except one. She said she had experience managing a working household, which was true if you defined working household to include her father's Memphis establishment, which was managed in the sense that someone was always managing it, and she had often been that someone. What she did not say was that she had never cooked a meal from raw ingredients in her life, had never or touched a horse that was not already saddled for her, and that her experience with cattle was limited to eating them. She boarded the train in Memphis in April with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, a leather-bound journal she had kept since she was 17, and the settled conviction that whatever she found in Wyoming, it would be more interesting than what she was leaving. She was right about that, at least. Adler met the train at the Laramie depot on a Tuesday afternoon. He had not thought much about what to do by way of preparation, beyond making sure the house was less embarrassing than usual, which mostly meant moving things off the floor that did not need to be on the floor. He stood on the platform and watched the passengers disembark, and recognized Sylvie Morrow immediately. Not because he had any way of knowing what she looked like, but because she was the only woman on the platform scanning her surroundings, the way a person scans surroundings when they are assessing a situation rather than looking for someone to help them. She had a trunk already pulled alongside her, a carpet bag over one arm, and she was looking at the main street of Laramie with the expression of someone doing arithmetic. He walked over and said his name. She looked at him directly, which some women did not, and said her name back, and then she said, "Your letter mentioned a solid house." He said, "It is solid." She said, "What does solid mean to you specifically?" He thought about it. "Doesn't move in the wind," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said, "let's go see it." The ride out to the ranch took an hour. They did not talk much. Adler was not a man who filled silence for the sake of it, and Sylvie, he would learn, was a woman who did not speak until she had something to say. The silence was not uncomfortable exactly, though it was not comfortable either. It was the silence of 2 people deciding something. She saw the house and did not say anything. He watched her not say anything. After a moment she said, "The roof." He said, "I'm going to fix it." She said, "When?" He said, "Before it rains again." She said, "When does it rain again?" He said, "Could be tomorrow." She said, "Then we have a lot to talk about." He had expected tears. He had expected the kind of reaction he'd heard other men describe. The horror, the refusal, the first night spent in silent devastation. What he got instead was a woman who walked the perimeter of the house, tested the floorboards with her heel, examined the stove with the focused attention of a doctor examining a patient, and then sat down at his table with her journal open and said, "Tell me everything that needs to be done, in order of what will kill you fastest if it isn't." Adler Crane stood in his own kitchen and felt the unfamiliar sensation of being taken seriously by someone else. He sat down and told her. What neither of them knew yet was the scale of what the other had misrepresented. Adler found out about the cooking on the first evening. He had assumed, when she said she managed a household, that she meant in the way women managed households, which was to say she could cook in it. He came in from the evening check on the cattle to find Sylvie standing at the stove, with the expression of a woman confronting an opponent. She had not prepared to fight. The biscuits were geological, dense in a way that suggested they had been formed under pressure. The salt pork was technically cooked in the sense that it was no longer raw but had been transformed into something that bore only a philosophical relationship to food. The coffee was the one success, and even then only because she had watched him make it that morning and done exactly what he had done, step by step, with the careful precision of someone who learns by watching. He ate all of it. He was a man who had survived 11 Wyoming winters by accepting what was in front of him without complaint. She watched him eat, then she said, "I should tell you something," he said. "All right," she said, "I can't cook." He set his fork down. "Your letter said household management." "I managed the people who cooked," she said. "I did not cook." "I understand that this is a significant distinction and I should have made it clear." He looked at the table for a moment, then, he said, "Can you learn?" She said, "I can learn anything, I learn quickly, but I need someone to show me and I need you to not make me feel stupid while I'm learning because I am not stupid and I won't be treated like I am." There was a pause. He said, "I know you're not stupid," she said. "How do you know?" "You've known me 4 hours," he said. The roof questions. She looked at him, he looked at her. Something between them that was not warmth yet, not exactly, but was the first brick of something that would eventually become warmth. "Show me how to make the biscuits right," she said. He showed her that night, and the biscuits the next morning were better, not good, but better, and that was the beginning. Sylvie found out about the cattle operation on the 3rd day. She had told herself she would be useful. She had meant it sincerely. She had also imagined useful would look like the kind of useful she was practiced at, organizing, managing, making systems out of chaos. What she had not fully reckoned with was that the chaos here was physical, in a way that Memphis chaos was not. Memphis chaos was paperwork and people. Wyoming chaos was livestock and weather and ground that wanted to kill you in ways that were specific and creative. The cattle were not what she had pictured. She had pictured cattle as she had seen them on the train.
Coming out.
Distant, pastoral, standing in fields in the golden afternoon looking like a painting. Up close they were large and indifferent and smelled like exactly what they were, which was large animals that lived outside. 40 of them, in various states of post-winter recovery. Adler took her out to the pasture that 3rd morning to show her the daily check. She stood at the fence, and he stood beside her, and he started talking about what he was looking at, which animals were still underweight from the winter. which one had a foot he was watching, what the condition of the grass meant for how much supplemental feed they'd need to carry into summer. She listened to all of it. She did not ask questions to seem engaged. She asked questions because she wanted to understand the system. At the end she said, "So the whole operation runs on you knowing what you're looking at?" "Yes," he said. "What happens when you can't look?" He was quiet for a moment. "Things die," he said. "That's what happened last winter. Couldn't be everywhere." She turned and looked at him. "Then I need to learn to see what you see." He said. "It takes years," she said. "Then we'd better start today." Adler Crane had hired hands before who hadn't said that. Men who'd been around cattle their whole lives and never thought to say start today. He filed the moment away without knowing what to do with it yet. The weeks that followed were an education for both of them. Though they would not have described it that way at the time. They would have said they were getting the operation running right. That was true. It was also something else. Sylvie learned to cook on the wood stove in the particular and unforgiving way that a wood stove demands, where too much fuel burns everything and too little leaves things raw, and the difference between the two is something you learn with your hands, and not your head. The biscuits moved from geological to acceptable to genuinely good in the space of 3 weeks. She learned to make salt pork that didn't taste like a punishment. She learned to put up preserves, and she was, it turned out, excellent at preserves, because preserving was a problem of precision, and she had a natural precision that she had been applying to ledgers for years and now applied to mason jars with exactly the same focused satisfaction. She also started learning the cattle. Not all at once, but she would go out with Adler in the mornings and he would show her what he was seeing. And she had a memory that worked the way she had promised. Show her once and it stayed. Within 6 weeks she could do the morning check alone and tell him accurately which animals needed his attention. What Adler learned was harder to name. He learned that he had been wrong about what he needed. He had thought he needed help. He had needed help, that was true. The operation did need another capable person, but what he had not known he needed was someone who asked questions. He had been alone long enough that his own thinking had started to go in circles, the same worries cycling through, the same decisions made the same ways because there was no one to say "Have you considered?" Sylvie asked questions about everything. Not to be difficult, because she genuinely wanted to understand, and in explaining things to her he found himself understanding them differently. She had also brought books. Not many. She had packed practically. She knew the situation she was going into, but she had not been able to leave entirely without them. 6 books in the bottom of the smaller trunk. She had thought she would read them privately in the evenings, a private comfort in an unfamiliar place. Instead, after the first 2 weeks, when the evenings began to feel less like an armed truce and more like 2 people recovering in the same room, she took out a book and read aloud. She read the way she did everything, directly, without performing it, as if the words were worth hearing and she trusted him to find them so. The first book was a collection of nature essays by someone Adler had never heard of. He sat in his chair by the stove and he did not say anything, but he did not leave the room either and he did not stop her. And when she reached a passage about the way light moved through a forest in early morning, he made a sound in his throat that was not quite a word but was not nothing either. She kept reading. By the 3rd evening he was asking her to go back to passages he had liked. By the 2nd week he was asking what the book was and could he look at it. He held it the way a man holds something he does not know is about to matter to him. She did not remark on it. She understood without him saying so, that remarking on it would be the wrong move. She just kept reading. He fixed the roof before the rain came. He was not a natural carpenter, and the patches were visible, but they held, and the night it rained in May she lay in her bed and listened to the water hit the roof and not come through, and felt something she recognized as relief and something adjacent to gratitude. The moment everything changed happened in June. Not a dramatic moment on the surface. There was no blizzard, no emergency on the scale of the original story, no animal dying, no crisis that required extraordinary courage. What there was instead was an afternoon. It was mid-June, the kind of afternoon Wyoming occasionally produces as if to apologize for its winters, warm and wide-skied, the grass still green enough from the spring rains, the cattle spread out across the far pasture in the peaceful way that meant everyone was fed and healthy. Adler had finished the fencing on the south end and come back in to find Sylvie at the table with the ranch ledger open in front of her, which was not where he had left it. He stopped in the doorway. She did not look up. She said, "You've been undercharging Dennison's operation for the last 2 years on the water access." He said, "That's not your ledger," she said. "You left it on the shelf and I needed to understand the financial picture. You have a gap in your July projections that doesn't account for the feed cost if summer goes dry, which it might, and you have 3 accounts that are paying 60 days late that you haven't charged interest on." She looked up. "I understand if you want me to put it back. But I've already found 4 places where you're losing money you don't have to lose." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Show me." She showed him. The 4 places became 6 as she walked him through it. He sat across the table and listened and asked questions and she answered them, and at some point during the second hour of this, he realized that he had not had a conversation like this since his brother died. A conversation where the other person knew what they were talking about, and he knew what he was talking about, and together they were working out something that mattered. He was not going to say that out loud, but she seemed to know anyway, the way she had known not to remark on the books. She just kept working. That evening she cooked a roast that was the best thing he had eaten in longer than he could remember, and he said so, which was more than he usually said about anything. And she said, "I've had practice now," and he said, "You learn fast," and she said, "I told you I did," and he said, "You did." There was a pause that was not the same kind of pause as the silences in the first week. This pause was full rather than empty. He said, "You could look at the accounts, regularly, if you were willing." She said, "I was hoping you'd say that." He said, "I should have asked sooner." She said, "Yes. But you didn't know what I could do." "Neither did you," he said. "No," she said. "But I figured I'd learn. The thing I want you to understand, if you've stayed with me this far, is that what happened next was not a sudden arrival. It was not a single moment where everything became clear. What happened was June became July, and July became August when the creek ran low the way he'd said it would, and they had worked out the supplemental water plan in advance so it wasn't a crisis, and August became September, and by September Sylvie Morrow had done something she had not done in Memphis in 10 years of being competent in other people's houses. She had made decisions that were her own. She had renegotiated the Denison water access fee and gotten it. She had reorganized the supply ordering to consolidate trips to Laramie and save a full day of travel per month. She had, on her own initiative, planted a kitchen garden along the south side of the house in the most protected spot. And by September, it was producing enough that she was putting up vegetables for winter, with the focused satisfaction of someone who has found the right problem for their particular mind. Adler watched all of this the way a man watches something he does not want to examine too closely because he is afraid that if he examines it, the thing might change. He knew what was happening. He was not a stupid man. He had just spent 11 years persuading himself that he did not need what he was now fairly certain he needed, and changing that opinion required more internal rearranging than he was used to. He made her a desk. It was not a good desk. He was a better rancher than he was a carpenter, and the proportions were slightly off, one leg marginally shorter than the others, so it required a shim to sit level. But it had a drawer with a small brass pull he had ordered from the hardware in Laramie, and it fit exactly under the window on the east side of the front room where she had taken to sitting in the mornings to write in her journal before the day started. He put it there one evening while she was out checking the cattle. She was doing the evening check now as naturally as if she had always done it, and went out to the barn to work on something and did not say anything when she came back in. She found it. He heard her stop moving inside the house. There was a silence. Then she came to the barn door and stood there. He did not look up from what he was doing. She said, "The drawer," he said, "had the pull lying around, figured it might as well be useful," she said. "It rocks a little, he shims under the left front leg," she said. "I see it." He worked. She stood, she said, "Adler." He looked up. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You've been writing on the kitchen table, didn't seem right." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite name. Then she said, "No, it didn't." She went back inside. He went back to work. The thing that had been building between them for 6 months settled into something solid, quietly, without announcement, the way the best things do. They married in October, in Laramie, in a ceremony that was small enough to fit in the courthouse with room to spare. Sylvie wore a dark blue dress she had brought from Memphis that was too fine for ranch work, and had been waiting for an occasion. Adler wore the one jacket he owned that did not have a working stain on it. The judge who performed the ceremony had married 3 other couples that morning and was efficient about it, which suited both of them. Afterward they had coffee at the hotel restaurant, which was as close to a wedding celebration as either of them wanted, and Sylvie wrote about it in her journal that evening at the desk by the window while Adler read one of her books by the lamp. He had been reading them in order. He was on the 3rd. Over the next 25 years the operation grew. The 220 acres became 400. The cattle herd stabilized and then expanded, and Sylvie's renegotiated contracts and consolidated supply chains saved enough over a decade that they could hire a permanent hand, which freed Adler from the worst of the solo work that had been slowly grinding him down. The roof was properly replaced in 1889. The house got a real addition in 1893, 2 more rooms and a proper kitchen with a stove that did not require prayer to operate. They had 2 sons and a daughter. Sylvie taught all of them to read from her Memphis books before they were old enough for the school in town. Adler taught all of them that a fence post driven halfway is worse than no fence post at all, and that the cattle always know more about what's coming than the almanac does, and that the difference between a good rancher and a dead rancher is whether you respect what you don't know yet. The 6 books she had brought from Memphis became 30 by 1895. They lived in a case Adler built along the wall in the front room, which was better than the desk. Though both of them agreed the desk was still his best work because it was his first. In 1901, when they had been married 14 years, a neighbor asked Adler at the feed store how he had ended up with a wife who could run a cattle operation and the books at the same time, and Adler thought about it for a moment and said, "I asked for someone practical and got someone who reads Emerson. Best confusion I ever walked into." The neighbor laughed. Adler was not joking, exactly. But he was not joking either. Sylvie Morrow. Sylvie Crane by then, though she had kept both names in her journal and on the accounts because she said a woman's name before marriage was not something to be tidied away, lived until 1931. She wrote in her journal every morning until the end, at the desk by the east window, watching the light come up over the Laramie Range, in the particular way that Adler had once tried, and mostly failed to put into a letter, and that she had come to know as well as she knew her own handwriting. She came expecting open land, and a chance at something different. He came expecting someone to manage the house while he managed the cattle. They were both right in ways they hadn't anticipated, and wrong in ways that turned out not to matter. What they built instead out of bad biscuits and a crooked desk and 6 months of learning to read the same sky lasted longer than either of them had promised. Which, if you think about it, is the only kind of thing worth building in the first place. I'll leave you with the same question this story keeps asking me, every time I come back to it. Who do you think arrived with less and left with more? And if you've got a story of your own, someone who showed up wrong and turned out exactly right, I'd like to hear it. It's right there in the comments, and I do read them. Everyone.